Good to see all of you this evening. I come up here and start getting ready, and my kids call it power because you all just get quiet. And I said, well, if I've got that kind of power, how come when you were kids it never happened? I could walk in that room and it'd take me 30 minutes to get their attention. But anyway, great to see everybody tonight. Thanks for sharing in our study together this evening. We're looking through these Bible scenes, in particular worship scenes, as it relates to different things. Again, we're not exhaustively looking at every single moment in the Scriptures that deal with a moment of worship. Just trying to pick a handful in every time period and see if there's something that we can learn from them. And right now we're in Exodus chapter 15. We're going to continue to talk a little bit today. Not a lot. We covered most of it Sunday, but I did want to come back to this because I kind of left it hang a little bit at the end. So I want to come back to the end of this text, talking for a few moments about the last couple of verses of our text out of 15. And then we'll jump over to chapter 19 and talk about a scene there that maybe you kind of looked at that and went, I don't know, Brian, that doesn't necessarily feel like worship in Exodus 19. But we'll talk a little bit about that before we finish our study. But if you would, before we get any further in our study this evening, if you would, bow your heads with me. Let's share in a word of prayer together. Our Father in heaven, thank you. You, again, bless us beyond measure. We are so humbled and appreciative of your testimony, your word that strengthens us, guides us, and leads us. We're thankful that we can look to the Old Testament. Let it be our schoolmaster. Let it educate us and teach us. Let us learn from it as it leads us to the time of Jesus and leads us to the new covenant founded in greater and more precious promises in the blood of the Lamb. So thankful for Jesus, thankful for the sacrifice He willingly gave and the promises that are bestowed upon us because of that. Give us a heart of receptiveness to your word. Give us an energy that wants to just abide by your will and to follow your teachings, and let our lives be a mirror of the life that you describe for us in your word. Strengthen us tonight, guide us in our study, and we pray all these things through thy Son's name. Amen. Okay, so this is who wrote this, by the way? Let's do the simple stuff first real quick here. Moses, right? This is the Song of Moses, it's often referred to as. It's written or sang when? After they've crossed, right? After they've crossed the Red Sea. And so in some ways we would call it what kind of moment? If you do charades, I'm trying to give it to you, but it's a celebratory, right? It's celebratory. They not only were they successfully able to traverse the Red Sea on dry ground with the water being held back, but once they cleared it, God used the very same water that He held back to come down and destroy the Egyptians. And so it's a celebratory song, but it's interesting in the kind of narratives that it expresses, right? Because it really just speaks to the power and might of God and how He was able to bring His destructive power against those who were trying to stop His process and the people that He had chosen for these purposes. And so you see that throughout these first 18 verses or 19 verses of Exodus chapter 15. That was our discussion on Sunday morning about all the various aspects of the character of God that Moses writes and the people then sing in response. And at the end of this process of this song that's being sung as Moses shares it with the people, Miriam, who's considered what at the end of the text, by the way? What description? It's prophetess, right? She's given the description of a prophetess there in verse 20. And she takes a timbrel. We told you Sunday morning that's probably the kin to what we would call a tambourine, right? And so she goes out and she's got the tambourine playing, and all the women go out after her with the tambourine, like the percussive type instruments. They've got dances, plural, meaning there's just, I don't know that there's necessarily even organization to that so much as there is just this celebratory dances, right? As they're just excited for what God has done for them. And they go through that process. I'll get back to it in a second. Then Miriam answers them, "Sing ye to the Lord, for He hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath He thrown into the sea." Now, just think about this a little bit. Were there distinctions between men and women in those days? Much more than we even see, right? Even there's some distinction in New Covenant as far as roles and responsibilities, but very distinct in those days. you almost get this imagery that it's Moses and who? Aaron and the men of Israel, right? And then the concluding segment here is that now Miriam is joined in, and she's brought the women out with her as they join into this celebratory worship before God, as they're singing, they're playing this percussive instruments and these dances that are connected to this celebration that they're having as a result of being able to pass through the Red Sea. Now, let me ask this question. Here's where the part I didn't really get to. What aspects of worship has God introduced to them yet? That's a strange way to ask it, but maybe you'll see where I'm trying to get here. And let me rephrase it. Has He given them any instructions about worship yet? Under the Mosaic. Okay, it's starting to come forward, right? So in this moment, as they now, I pause a little bit because we're going to back up if we get there tonight, but we're going to back up into chapter 12 eventually. But that actually goes back to the plagues of Egypt, where He establishes what will happen during the Passover, right? He's going to give them what worship aspects are going to happen during the Passover. They get it ahead of time. Its full implementation doesn't happen till later in their history. My point is, at this stage in Exodus chapter 15, after they've just crossed the Red Sea, they don't even know how God wants them to worship yet. They haven't been given the fullness of instructions on how to worship. In fact, we know they have issues, right, with it, because when they run into the obstacles of Moses not coming back down from the mountain, we'll see that, not really, but a little bit in our next text. But what was their reaction to that? And they went back to the worship of whom? Egypt, right? They went back to the worship of Egypt because that was the worship they knew. That's the worship they knew, right? When they fashioned that golden calf, when they're the foothills of Mount Sinai there, they formed a golden calf for a reason, because that's what they knew out of Egypt. They just didn't arbitrarily decide. You often hear me say, why not a squirrel or a badger, right? There was a reason, and the reason is because a calf was a sacred and a religious symbol to the Egyptians. So here's my point. They're doing the best they can to present an act of worship before God without any specific instruction as to how to do that. This is pure reactionary worship that just comes from within them and their desires to want to celebrate what God has just done for them. And so I simply illustrate that there's some caution, right, we have to take when we think about this scene, because God's still implementing what it is that He's looking for from them and what He desires. There's things to be learned. I'm cautious to say there's things to be emulated, right? Because number one, it's no instructions have come yet exactly, and also it's a different covenant, right? It's Old Testament, and we wouldn't necessarily emulate this any more than we would emulate the incense or the sacrifices, or right? I wouldn't any more emulate this in New Testament times than I would any other aspect of worship under the Old Testament law. That's the distinction that we've got to keep in mind. There are things to be learned, not necessarily things to be emulated.
Groundwork had been laid for it back even with Abraham, because they sacrificed back then.
Yeah, if they retained any of it. But when you 400 years of being outside of the governance of God under Egyptian rule and right. So there's, I always look at that. Now, I'm not overstating your point. I understand what you're saying, but Moses was concerned that when he would go back and lead them out of Egypt, they wouldn't even know who, they wouldn't know, but who God was, right? They wouldn't even know who God was. Who am I supposed to tell them who sent me? And so God, Jehovah God, had been so alienated from their mindset, they're struggling to come to terms with him. And again, I'll take you back to Sinai. When they don't think Moses came back soon enough, they immediately revert back to what they did know over that span of time, an Egyptian. But you're right, there could have been some ability to retain certain things out of that patriarch system, because the Mosaic law is just now coming to them. Go ahead, Mike.
Aaron said that he triumphed gloriously, and the horse and rider he had thrown into the sea. It puts me in mind that they thought Pharaoh was a god.
Yeah. Well, and certainly Pharaoh thought he was, and elevated himself in that fashion. And I suppose there is a sense here in throughout this song, and then Miriam's reiteration of this song, that Pharaoh had tremendous power that they never thought could be conquered, and they just witnessed their God taking care of him. And they're certainly celebrating. So if not emulation, then what do we learn from the text? Yeah, it ought to mean something, right? It ought to come. It ought to come because of God, what He's done, what He's accomplished, how He's helped. Right? That's what they're doing. They're celebrating what He accomplished there in that scene. So that's heartfelt is part of that learning. Go ahead, Colin.
This is, even though this was written way after, I think this is a perfect example of the New Testament writing, sing, make a joyful melody to the Lord from your heart, bring back the heartfelt worship. This was almost reactionary worship, and this was coming straight from how they felt about God. This isn't like, oh, I'm going to worship, or I'm going to do this because I did this. No, it's how they felt about it.
Right. Yeah. It definitely is reactionary to what they had witnessed and seen, because they don't have any structure yet as it relates to how they're supposed to be worshiping, because the law hasn't come yet. And when they get that, then they'll get their structure. But it certainly feels that way. What else? Anything else that you see there? I'm trying to get you to stretch your brains a little bit when you're looking at these texts. Not just, there's easy thoughts. Go ahead, Jeff.
Call it a miraculous fusion of faith and joy that brought them to the point where they could give this, because they were right before that. If you put yourself in the mind of the Israelites, you're looking at a giant body of water and a great big army coming up on you, and dust trailing their horses behind you. You figure you're done. You're dead.
Yeah.
And
Which they did. Yeah.
You just went from a hero.
Yeah. And worthy of celebrating that in that response. And so they're recognizing the realities of what their circumstance was just about to be in their minds anyway, even though God understood what He was doing to do, but to the exact opposite of that, from defeat to victory. And that was worthy to be worshiped. Worship the God who did that. What else did you see?
Accomplishment of God, and therefore showing faith.
Okay, so you see faith in their worship there as they acknowledge what God had accomplished and done in that scene.
They're not claiming the victory themselves.
It would have, and I suppose it's one of those scenes that's pretty obvious, right? They didn't do any of it, and when you don't do any of it at all, your reaction should be to praise the God who did do all of those things.
It wasn't long after all this happened that they had left God.
Yeah, they'll struggle, and it won't be very long before they start struggling. That's for sure. Go ahead, Amy.
The realization of what it means to be a child of God.
Yeah, and they're starting to awaken to that, right? Up until now, they're like, well, we saw those plagues. Feels like that's a God we ought to go ahead. And I imagine there was some reluctance. I mean, there was some reluctance early on in relationship to but it takes time, right? And slowly they begin to awaken to what God is doing.
They must have wondered why the plagues didn't exactly hit them the way it hit the rest of the Egyptians. so they must have been asking questions at least about that.
Yeah, some of them. They would have learned about the Passover, didn't. Some of them did. They had to experience, I think, the frogs at least, with some other things like everybody else.
They should have known, they learned from this, that God was all powerful, he could do some pretty powerful things.
Yeah,
But yet, when they didn't have something to drink, they're,
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
drink.
yeah, and that's a. So let me and try to take note of, because this will help you go where I'm trying to get you with these texts. So let me just run it back and real quick to you. And I just want you to know. So look at some of the language in relationship to the things that they're talking about. Early on, he talks about the great overthrown them, verse 7, that rose up against thee. Thou sentest forth thy wrath, which consumed them as stubble. Speaking of, and with the blast of thy nostrils the water were gathered together, the flood stood upright as an heap, and the depths were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil, my lust shall be satisfied upon them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. Thou dost blow with thy wind, and sea covered them. They sank as lead in the mighty waters. Here's what I want you to notice. That is specific to the moment. Sometimes worship should be specific to the moment, right? Worship should not always be just general, this is what we do when we worship, right? Randomness, no specific reasoning or thought as to why. I think we can learn from them that not everything that you see in worship this way. This is one example that we're looking at here. But to me, one of the things I took away from that was their worship is very specific to the situation they just experienced. That it wasn't just a generic, well, thank you, God, right? Thanks. We were about to be destroyed by the Egyptian army, and you parted this big body of water in front of us, and you used that body of water to destroy them behind us, and we really appreciate it, right? No, right? That's just that kind of general thanksgiving that is fair enough in some settings, but what I love about it is their worship is just exactly what you should be saying in light of the moment you're in, and we can find moments like that. Go ahead.
I remember as a teenager, of course, so it was here, I can't remember exactly how far back. There were a bunch of us, and we went outside to watch the lunar eclipse, and we just started singing How Great Thou Art. One of those moments where something we were specifically looking at, seeing the power of God in this lunar eclipse, and then acknowledging it.
Yeah, spontaneous reaction to what was happening in front of us. And I remember that night when that happened. I can remember back in 2001, September 11th, Mo was in a meeting out Muddy Creek that week. And Deborah and I packed the kids in the car that evening, and we drove down to Muddy Creek, and you could sense it and feel it. And please don't take this critical of anybody that was present there or the church at Muddy Creek. That's not my point here. But everybody was afraid to say anything about it. You know what I mean? There were quiet conversations, but we didn't know what we were supposed to do. And I remember being asked to lead the opening prayer, and in my mind I'm going, okay, Brian, you can't ignore it, right? You can't ignore that. And what I appreciated about it later was, as I learned and I thought, boy, how smart they were and how not smart I was in that moment. A lot of churches gathered. They just gathered and prayed. They just specifically made the decision, this situation warrants us coming together and praying. Now, Muddy Creek situation, they were already meeting, right? They were already scheduled to be together, and so it happened through that process. But there were a lot of other churches who had no intentions of coming together that night, but when it happened, they saw it as a moment. We can learn from that, right? We can learn from these folks. The moment drove the desire and need for worship. Do we have structured times for worship? And I don't necessarily mean on a given clock hour, but yes, upon the first day of the week, right? Upon the first day of the week, there's specific instruction in the New Testament of a specific time that God wants His people to come together and worship. He's commanded it, He's instructed it, right? So there are moments like that. But sometimes worship should just come from the situation and circumstance that you find yourself in. That's what they're doing in Exodus chapter 15.
Two different instances in Florida that where we had lost both of our preachers, and both had passed away. And at those moments, the worship that we did was prayer.
Yeah.
We just pretty much, it was back to back to back.
Yeah.
Prayer, a couple songs, and then
Yeah.
just prayer.
Yeah. And that takes forethought a little bit, and sometimes I got to figure out which hat I'm wearing, but you know, leadership needs to think about that sometimes and what circumstance. But anyway, I just wanted you to notice that, how specific that worship was.
I mean, you know, you talked about just prayer within the congregation, but sometimes I think spontaneous worship like that can be like just individual prayer. I could give an example. There was a time I had gone to a summer camp, and it was a Bible camp. We had just felt just God in our presence with, you know, how we were doing stuff to worship God, that we just sat there in silence. We didn't have anybody leading a prayer, but we just sat there in silence and kind of just was in awe of the power of God that we could feel at that point.
And certainly we should be ever mindful of His presence and the power that He has. And I want to make sure we understand it. There's spontaneity here in the sense that they're using the moment they're in to guide the worship. There's organization in it because Moses took the time to what? Wrote a song about it. Well, here it goes. Never mind. Some of you may catch that reference, and some of you won't. Nobody got that. That's all right. I'll tell you later what that was. But anyway, I'm getting rolled eyes. So, any other thoughts? Go ahead, Mike.
You don't have to preach. A lot of times you just have to sing.
Yeah, any act of worship can be right for the moment. Can be right for the moment. All right.
Some of us would get together and sing and not let the people out.
Yeah. Let's run over to Exodus 19 then. Let's look at this next text. And this is trickier, right? This is a little trickier. And hopefully you'll understand why I wanted to share it as we kind of search a little bit to see what, if anything's even worship here as it relates to this text. And I'll give you a reason when we get further in. So I asked, let me ask these questions a little different. Let me read the text. Verse 16 beginning, Exodus chapter 19. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God. I don't know that you can meet with God and it not have some aspect of worship, right? They came out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. When the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai, on the mount on the top of the mount. And the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. And let the priests also which come near to the Lord sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. And Moses said unto the Lord, The people cannot come up to the Mount Sinai, for thou chargest us, saying, Set bounds about the mount, and sanctify it. And the Lord said unto him, Away, get thee down, and thou shalt come up, thou and Aaron with thee. But let not the priest and the people break through to come up unto the Lord, lest he break forth upon them. So Moses went down unto the people and spoke to them. All right, so he's prepping for the time that Moses will go up onto the mountain, right? And so how would you describe the scene itself? Yeah, it's pretty scary, right? You've got this sound of thunder. You've got this imagery. You've got this fire. The mountain is just covered in smoke because of the presence of God, and the trumpet seems to be doing what? Yeah, it's just getting louder and louder. The text says so. They're beginning to respond to that. Let's answer some of the initial questions. So do you? I just read those 9 or 10 verses to you. So any of that would you consider worship? I gave you one hint as I was reading it. Okay, so at least for a certain distance, right? There's restrictions, there's boundaries around the mount that they're not allowed to break through. But to a certain point, they come before God, right? They're coming into the presence of God. That's where I want you to focus your mind for our study purposes and how this text fits into our learning. They are coming into the very presence of God with boundaries and limits and restrictions, but they are experiencing the out-and-out presence of Jehovah. It's visible, it's audible, and they're trembling as a result of that. When you come into the presence of God. Any other part that you might notice or you would think of that would lead us to think worship?
I don't know if maybe I was thinking a little too far-fetched, but even the mountain was responding to God's presence.
Yeah. And there's imagery of that throughout the Old Testament in particular, of how even the earth responds to God and often pays him more respect than his people did. Yeah.
Even if everybody else is quiet, you hear the stones cry out.
Yeah. So in this text, you see this presence, right? And I think that's why we connect it to worship. They're coming into the presence of God, very, very specifically. In what manner were they supposed to approach him? Well, they couldn't get real close. Yeah. So there's preparation, right, that needs to take place. There's this is a little less spontaneous, like they were out of the Red Sea, and this is more exactly what God tells them to do. Right? There's a difference. So there are times where certain kinds of worship are reactions to what God has done or the needs that we may have of him. There's a part of worship that falls in that line of thought, but there are also times that worship fits within the very specific and direct commands and instructions of God and the preparation that they would need to take place in relationship to that. Yeah. So notice verse 22. Let the priests also which come near to the Lord sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. I'm hesitant. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to give you a chance first, though. I don't want to. Okay. So we're getting so how, with preparation, with boundaries, with recognition of what God, and when, again, at God's instructions, right? And during this time period in which eventually Moses and Aaron are going to go up and they're going to receive ultimately the commands and law of God. Okay, so let's talk about it. So what do you see in this text that you could, again, not emulate? You can't emulate any of this, by the way. You can't emulate any of this. But what can we learn from it?
If they don't follow instructions, they're going to die.
Okay, so these instructions don't leave anything to chance, right? They are so specific and directed in such ways that he says, listen, I'm telling you, if anything comes up here, it's going to die, right? Beast, man, whatever. I'm setting a boundary as to how many or how close the people can get in terms of their access to me. What else do you see as far as the connection to worship? I mean, there's lots of history here, but the acts of worship.
As far as coming before God, come before Him with fear and trembling when you go to worship Him.
Yeah.
Because God is a great and a powerful God, and we are less than a grain of sand on the seashore.
Yeah. So let's respect whose presence we're coming into, right? There is, I think there's a need for us to be, to give some very careful thought. Again, we're not standing before Mount Sinai. There's no trumpet playing. There's no smoke. There's no fire. There's no lightning. There's no thunder, right? There's none of that seen. But I think I can learn that when you come into the presence of God, there's a level of respect for that needs to take place. I tell you, I try to remind folks all the time, this isn't, you think about how we would come into certain people's presence and how we might behave differently. I've illustrated that to you hundreds of times by talking about the fact that anytime I walk into, and I don't go into regular barbershops much anymore, but anytime back in the day I'd walk into a barbershop, and once those barbers would get to know me, the first thing out of their mouth would be, hey, it wouldn't be my first name, it would be, hey, preacher. Because everybody in the room now knows that they've got to behave because the preacher showed up, right? Not do it right, doesn't matter. But God, right? Come into the presence of God, that's different. There's something different about that. Yeah. There's something very, very different about when we come into the presence of God, particularly in moments of worship. Then that should be reflective of me. And God ought to be able to see it in me. Let me expand a little bit on that. So in verse 22, and let the priests also which come near to the Lord sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. Who are the priests now? We are. New Testament writers say you are a royal priesthood, a chosen generation. And who's our high priest? That's Jesus. That's our Hebrew study that we just finished. That's Jesus. Now again, I'm not emulating, I'm learning. And what I learn is the priesthood had an even more specific right? Kind of mindset and preparatory things, the sanctification, the things they needed to do, because they were coming even more specifically into the presence of God for their purposes, that they would be honoring and serving. Notice, the warnings God gave. Notice verse 23 again. Moses said unto the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for thou chargest us, saying, set bounds about the mount and sanctify. So God just told him, go down and tell the people, don't come up here, right? And Moses says, what? Why? Right? That's what he's saying. Why? We've already done that. We've already told them. We already charged them not to do that. We've already given them instructions that they're not allowed up here. Why? And God's saying they may need to be reminded. Sometimes when it comes to making sure that we refresh our memories about the kinds of respect God deserves, right? And even the boundaries that He has created. What else did you see? I'm going to show you something else here in a minute.
This is a different heartfelt. The other was joyous and celebratory. This is very reverential and fearful of, look at what they're looking at. Earlier they were looking at, we just crossed this Red Sea on dry land and we're here, we're safe. This is a different heart that's viewing this in a sense.
And yet they did see him destroy Egypt, the armies of Egypt. They witnessed that part too, and they sang about it. And so they're beginning to build a proper fear and trembling of God.
There's one thing I think do emulate through all of this, and I think it's a little harder to put together, but God tells us we have to meet on the first day of the week. And it's by the elders' decision that say we meet on Wednesdays, because as a reminder for us about what we need to do with God and everything. I think this is kind of one of the very first examples of there being a reminder to what God has said to do.
Sure, and he's gonna make that effort to do it. It is important to be reminded and refreshed. I want you to notice something else. Our time's going to be going here in about 2 or 3 minutes, but I want you to notice one other thing. See, he says in verse 21, and the Lord said unto Moses, go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to what? To gaze, and many of them perish. And I thought a lot about that, right? God isn't someone or some being to be just simply gawked at, right? He's not someone that you just right? Because a lot of people might witness something of God and stand and go, wow, right? Wow. That could have been the celebration at the Red Sea, but it wasn't. It wasn't just wow. No, it was God with His blasting nostrils blew that wind and knocked that water right back over on Pharaoh and his army and destroyed all of them, right? It wasn't just, wow, God. It was, no, here's what God, He's concerned. God is concerned that He will just become a gazing stock to them, right? He's concerned that they'll just see Him as something you just look at and just stand in amazement of and not learn anything from and not have any respect for. You tell them, don't come up here. Don't see the smoke and the fire and hear the trumpet and all the things that want to draw your attention. I'm demonstrating my power, but you tell them, do not try to break through to get a better look. And you know what? You think, well, who in their right mind, in after what they've witnessed and seen, would even try to do that? There's 1 million plus people. I guarantee you there's one of them thinking he can what? Get a better look and get away with it. And God says, you remind them. You remind them. that if they even have an inkling that they might just try to get a little better look, it's not going to end well. It's not going to end well. Worship demands that we respect the one that we're worshiping. Worship demands that we recognize that we have been offered a very special privilege through the high priest, Jesus the Christ, to come into the very presence of God. I would argue in imagery, we are permitted to draw closer than they were to the mountain. That Jesus has opened up a pathway for us through His sacrifice, being the high priest that sacrificed Himself as the Lamb. He has opened up an access to us that's even closer than they were allowed to get to God at that mountain, and which should demand of us an even higher level of respect and admiration for God. It's an interesting text. You don't really see acts of worship happening here necessarily. You don't see anything specific like the Song of Moses, but you do learn about how it is you come into the presence of God, which is what worship is, coming into His presence. Lord willing, on Sunday, I'll come back. We'll start looking back to chapter 12. I want to go back. I know it's a weird way to do that, to take you forward, then go back. But what we learn in chapter 12 is the introduction of the Passover and the instructions as it relates to worshiping God through the Passover. Though they're getting it in the moment in chapter 12, they implement that throughout their history from that point forward. So we're going to go back to chapter 12 and do that.
Just happened to see a reference on the voice of the trumpet. In Revelation chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, and also in chapter 4, verse 1, it mentions the voice of the
Yeah, you see some parallel there. Yeah, you can see some parallel. All right, Lord willing, I'll come back to that. And then go ahead and start reading that last section of our Old Testament portion, where we're going to talk about the days of the kings, right, and some of those latter prophets, or later prophets as it relates. And I've got 3 texts I want to share with you there. So you probably at least should look at the first one of that section before Sunday. No promises. Sunday's a little shorter than Wednesday's even, time-wise, but we may get to it. So be sure you're at least reading that far.